3 days into our silence, I walked into my husband's office with a pregnancy test hidden in my coat pocket, ready to tell him we were going to be parents. He spoke first. "Let's get a divorce." His hands were folded on the desk, like a man who had rehearsed this moment. Beside his elbow sat a manila folder I had never seen before. I kept my hand in my pocket, crushing the napkin-wrapped test against my knuckles, and said nothing about the 2 pink lines. The folder was dated 2 days ago, but let me start from the beginning. I appreciate you pressing play on this one. Before we begin, leave me a comment. Have you ever discovered someone was making decisions about your life behind your back? Yes or no? I want to hear it. Your words mean more to me than you realize. A few details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes. The lesson at its core is what I hope stays with you. 3 days into our silence, I discovered I was pregnant. And when I walked into his office to tell him, he spoke first, "But I need to go back to the bathroom." The fluorescent light above the mirror had been buzzing since November, a faint electrical whine that Palmer said he would fix, and never did. I stood on the cold tile floor of our Burlington apartment at 7 in the morning, holding a plastic stick between 2 fingers, watching 2 pink lines develop under that flickering light, like a photograph emerging in a dark room. Slow. Irreversible. I was 29 years old, a senior financial consultant who could read a balance sheet the way most people read a menu, and I could not make sense of the simplest equation I had ever been handed. 2 lines, 1 life. 0 words exchanged in this apartment for 72 hours. The fight had been 3 days earlier. Palmer canceled our 3rd wedding anniversary dinner by text 40 minutes before the reservation. I had already put on the dress. He came home past midnight, smelling like cold air and conference rooms. And when I asked where he had been, he said he did not owe me a minute-by-minute accounting of his Tuesday. I told him our home was not a transit lounge. He told me I manufactured conflict the way other people manufactured small talk. Neither of us spoke again after that. Not good morning, not good night. Not a single mug left in the sink, as proof that another human being still lived here. Have you ever held a secret so fragile that speaking it aloud felt like it might shatter both you and the person listening? I wrapped the test in a paper napkin, slipped it into the pocket of my wool coat, and pressed my palm flat against the fabric until I could feel the hard plastic casing through the layers. He wanted a daughter with my eyes and his stubborn streak. He said that on our honeymoon, standing on a dock in Maine, with salt on his lips and a future he seemed to believe in, surely 2 pink lines could still reach that man. I drove to Gallagher Technologies headquarters at noon. The building sat on the eastern edge of Burlington, like a glass monument to a family that had been building things in Vermont for 3 generations. I parked in the visitor lot because Palmer had never added my name to the employee registry, a detail I had noted once and filed under things that probably did not mean anything. The lobby smelled like recycled air and new carpet. His office was on the 4th floor, corner unit. More square footage than our first apartment. I pushed open the door without knocking because I was his wife and I was carrying his child, and I had not spoken to him in 3 days, and I was done waiting for permission to exist in his life. I did not even stand up when I walked in. That was when I knew. Palmer Gallagher, 31, lead systems architect at his family's tech conglomerate, sat behind his mahogany desk with his hands folded and his monitor turned slightly away. as if whatever had been on the screen a moment ago was not something I was meant to see. He had the composed stillness of a man who had rehearsed his next sentence for days. His coffee was cold. The overhead light caught the edge of a manila folder positioned exactly between his elbows. "I have been thinking about this carefully," he said. "Let us get a divorce." The word landed in the center of my chest, like a stone dropped into still water. My right hand was inside my coat pocket, fingers wrapped around the napkin. The plastic casing of the pregnancy test pressing into my knuckles with a small, sharp pain that was the only thing keeping me inside my own body. "Give me a reason," I said. "We are both exhausted, you know that." "That is not a reason. That is a weather report." I exhaled through his nose and looked past me, toward the window, toward Burlington, spreading out below us in the pale March light. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He sat there, with the patience of a man who had already made the decision and was simply waiting for the other person to arrive at the same conclusion. I looked down at the manila folder. It was open. I could see the header of a separation agreement, both our names typed in neat serif font, the blanks already filled. And beneath our names, a date. 2 days ago. I had drafted this agreement before our silence even reached its third morning. Before I bought the test. Before I stood on that cold tile floor and watched 2 pink lines rewrite every plan I had ever made. This was not exhaustion talking. This was not a marriage falling apart in real time. This was a man executing a sequence, and I had walked into his office believing I held the news that would save us, while he sat behind a document that proved he had already left. My fingernails pressed through the napkin until the plastic bit into my knuckles. I kept my hand in my pocket. I said one word, "Fine," and the test stayed where it was, pressed against my palm like a grenade with the pin still in. While I turned and walked out of his office, without telling him he was going to be a father. I did not make it to the elevator before I turned around. The test was still in my pocket. The word "fine" was still hanging in the air of his office like smoke. And I needed one answer before I could leave this building and decide what kind of woman I was going to become. I pushed his door open again. He had not moved. The manila folder was still between his elbows. Our names still typed in neat serif font, the date still 2 days old. I stood in the doorway and asked the only question that mattered. "How long, Palmer? A week? A month? Since before you canceled our anniversary dinner?" His jaw tightened. I watched the muscles shift beneath the skin, the way you watch a fault line move small, precise, seismic. He leaned forward and placed both palms flat on the desk. "It is not about a date," he said. "The Portland branch needs someone full-time. Dad has been building the expansion for over a year. This is the right moment for both of us to start fresh. You said both of us, but you drafted that folder alone." He did not answer. He looked at the window again, at Burlington below, at anything that was not my fate. Portland. A branch office I had never heard of, an expansion his father had apparently been engineering for a year, and a divorce time to coincide with a corporate relocation, like a line item on a project plan. I stood there long enough to understand that silence was its own kind of confession. He was not going to tell me how long, because the answer would prove that our anniversary dinner, our Cold War, our 72 hours of nothing, all of it had been theater. The ending was written before the third act even started. Let me tell you something about silence. Between 2 people who share a bed, it is louder than in any argument. An argument at least acknowledges that both people are in the room. Silence says one of you has already left. I drove home. The apartment was exactly as I had left it that morning. Fluorescent light still buzzing in the bathroom. My coffee cup rinsed and placed upside down on the drying rack. His coffee key still on the counter, with a ring of brown residue dried at the rim. His tie was draped over the armchair by the window. His running shoes were missing from the shoe rack by the door. Half his life was still here. The other half had already been packed into a future I was not part of. I took off my coat and hung it on the hook. Then I took it down again. I reached into the pocket and pulled out the napkin, unfolded it on the kitchen counter, and stared at the 2 pink lines under the overhead light. They had not faded. They were not going to fade. This was not a maybe. This was a certainty growing inside me at the rate of a few hundred cells per hour. Indifferent to divorce agreements and Portland branches, and men who could not answer a simple question about time. The apartment felt like a museum exhibit of a marriage. Everything in its place, labeled, preserved behind glass, and completely lifeless. I picked up the test and carried it to the bedroom. I opened the bedside drawer, the one on my side, the side that still smelled like my lotion and my paperback novels and my reading glasses, and I set the test inside, on top of a birthday card Palmer had written me the year before. The card said something about forever. I closed the drawer. If I showed him these 2 lines, he would stay. I knew that with the certainty of a woman who had studied his face for 3 years and could read his guilt the way I read quarterly projections, he would stay not out of love, out of obligation. And obligation is just resentment with a longer fuse. I went to the kitchen sink and filled a glass with tap water. It tasted like pipes and cold mineral, and the particular flavor of a decision you cannot take back. I drank the whole glass standing up, because sitting down felt like something a person who had given up would do. This child would not be a leash. If Palmer walked out, he walked out not knowing what he left behind. I would not beg. I would not bargain. I would not slide a pregnancy test across a mahogany desk and watch a man rearrange his plans out of duty instead of love. I had watched my own mother do that, trade her dignity for a man's reluctant presence, and I had promised myself at 16 that I would never repeat the transaction. I closed the drawer on those 2 pink lines the way you close a casket. Gently, because what is inside still matters, even if no one else will ever see it. The apartment went dark around me. I did not turn on the lights. I lay on my side of the bed, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, one hand resting on my stomach, and the other on the cold cotton of the empty pillow beside me. At 9:47, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit the dark room in pale blue. Fiora's name appeared above a single message. "Are you okay? I ran into someone from Gallagher Tech tonight. They said Palmer is already packing for Portland. Call me." The news had traveled beyond our walls before I had even decided what to do with the secret still locked inside my bedside drawer. I called Fiora from the car. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she had been holding her phone since sending that text, waiting. I told her I was driving to Winooski. She said she would leave the porch light on. Fiora Coleman, 29, a freelance graphic designer who had been my closest friend since our freshman orientation at UVM, opened the cottage door before I even knocked. She was in paint-stained pajamas and bare feet. Her dark hair twisted into a knot held together by a pencil, and she pulled me inside without asking a single question. The smell of turpentine and linseed oil hit me the moment I crossed the threshold. the permanent perfume of a woman who turned her living room into a studio and never apologized for it. She locked the front door behind us. I sat on her couch. She sat across from me on the floor, cross-legged, watching my face the way she watched her canvases, looking for the thing beneath the surface that had not been said yet. I reached into my coat pocket and placed the pregnancy test on the coffee table between us. The white plastic looked almost luminous against the dark wood, the two pink lines still vivid under the glow of her single-floor lamp. Fiora stared at it. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at the test again. "Palmer does not know," I said. "Palmer asked you for a divorce," she said. It was not a question. She already knew half of it from whoever she had spoken to at the Gallagher offices. "This afternoon, with a pre-drafted agreement, if you have ever placed your worst secret on a table in front of the one person you trust most, you know the relief is not immediate. It comes only after they pick it up and do not flinch." Fiora did not flinch. She erupted. She was off the floor in a single motion, pacing the length of the living room, her slippers slapping the hardwood like punctuation marks on every sentence she fired. "He said what to you? While that was in your pocket? I will drive to his office right now and dismantle that man one syllable at a time." "Sit down," I said. "Anger is not a plan." "You are right. Anger is not a plan. Anger is what happens before the plan." She stopped pacing. She pressed both hands against her face, breathed in, breathed out, and when she lowered her hands, the fury was still there, but it had been compressed into something harder and more useful. "Okay, we are doing this. Step 1, doctor. You need a prenatal confirmation from an actual physician, not a drugstore stick. Step 2, lawyer. I know someone, a woman I did branding work for last year. Galilea Goodwin. Family law. Sharp. Not afraid of money. Step 3, you tell no one about this baby until every piece of paper has your signature and a judge's stamp on it. Not his mother. Not your mother. Not God himself. She was already building the architecture of my survival, and the chamomile tea she had pushed into my hands was too hot to drink, burning the tip of my tongue, but I held the mug anyway, because having something warm to grip was the only thing preventing my hands from shaking. "The baby calls you Mom, calls me Auntie, and calls Palmer, actually. Let us not waste a title on him yet." I almost smiled. Almost. Fiora stopped pacing, turned to face me, and said something I was not prepared for. "You are keeping this baby. I already know. So let us stop pretending there is a decision to make and start building a wall around you both." She was right. There was no decision. There had never been a decision. There was only a fact growing inside me, and everything else would have to arrange itself around that fact or get out of the way. The cottage went quiet. The floor lamp hummed. Fiora poured herself a second cup of tea and sat on the couch beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched. "There is something else," she said, and her voice had changed. Lower, more careful. "A woman I did branding work for. A freelance designer, she took a contract with Gallagher Technologies about 2 years ago. She told me the old man runs that family like a boardroom. Every hire, every contract, every relationship has his fingerprints on it. You think Palmer's father told him to divorce me? What kind of family drafts? A separation agreement for their son, the way they would draft a contract termination clause? I think that family is not simple," she said. "And I think you should find out who wrote that agreement before you sign anything else." She pulled a blanket from the back of the couch and draped it over my shoulders. tucking the edges behind my arms, the way she had done 100 times during college when I fell asleep studying. Then she stood and walked to the bedroom door. "One more thing," she said quietly. She did not turn around. The designer who worked for Gallagher Tech. She told me the old man had already picked someone for Palmer, years ago, before you were even married. She turned off the light and left me in the dark with that sentence, the blanket around my shoulders, and a pregnancy test still sitting on the coffee table, like a grenade no one had figured out how to defuse. I spent the next 5 days telling myself, Fiora's rumor was gossip. A second-hand story from a freelance designer who probably heard it at a holiday party after too much wine. People exaggerate. Families are complicated. Not every controlling father is orchestrating his son's divorce from behind a mahogany desk. Then I saw the boarding pass. I was at a cafe 2 blocks from my office, standing in line for a sandwich I did not particularly want. When I noticed a man at a corner table I recognized from a Gallagher Technologies holiday mixer the previous December. I was scrolling through his messages with the careless speed of someone who did not expect to be watched. His thumb paused on a forwarded screenshot, and I saw the airline logo first, then the route Burlington to Portland, then the passenger name, then the date, January 9th. Palmer had booked round-trip tickets to Portland on January 9th. We were still sharing a bed in January. He kissed me goodnight on January 9th. I remember because it was a Wednesday, and he had come home early for once. And we ate leftover pasta, standing at the counter, and he had laughed at something I said about the weather. And for 30 minutes, I had believed we were fine. I was booking flights to his new life while I was reheating his dinner. There is a particular kind of betrayal that does not arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrives with a booking confirmation, dated 8 weeks before the man even bothered to look you in the eye and lie. I raised my phone slowly, angled it toward his screen as if I were checking a text, and pressed the shutter button twice. The colleague swiped to the next message without looking up. I saved the photo in a new folder on my phone. I named it Receipts. The word felt clinical. It was supposed to. Fiora had said, the old man picked someone for Palmer years ago. These tickets were booked months before our Cold War, months before the predated agreement, months before Palmer sat behind his desk and called it exhaustion. The timeline was not his. It was a schedule, and he was following it the way he followed every directive that came from the 4th floor of that glass building, obediently, on time, without asking whether the person being replaced deserved a warning. I left the cafe without ordering. The sandwich did not matter. The coffee I had been holding had gone cold and bitter in my grip, and I set it on the counter by the door without looking back. That evening, my phone rang at 8:14. Unknown number. I answered on the 4th ring. Silence. Not the silence of a dropped call or a bad connection. A held silence. Someone was on the other end, breathing or not breathing, listening or waiting. And the line stayed open for 4 full seconds before it disconnected with a soft click. A silent phone call is a strange weapon. It does not wound. It just lets you know someone is holding the blade and choosing not to swing it yet. The second call came the next morning at 6:45 while I was brushing my teeth. Same path. 6 rings. Dead air. 4 seconds. Click. The third came that afternoon while I was reviewing a client portfolio at my desk. I answered, waited, counted the seconds in my head, and when the click came, I wrote down the time in the margin of my notes. 8:14. 6:45. 2:22. No pattern I could find. No voice I could identify. Just present someone reminding me they were there without telling me why. The sedan appeared on a Tuesday. Dark blue Chevrolet, tinted windows, parked across the street from my apartment building in a visitor space that was almost never used. I noticed it because I notice things. That is what financial consultants do. We look at numbers and patterns and anomalies, and a car that appears in the same spot 2 mornings in a row with no one entering or leaving is an anomaly. The first morning, I told myself it belonged to a contractor working in the building. The second morning, I noticed the engine was running. The third morning, I stood at my kitchen window with my coffee and watched it for 11 minutes. No one got out. No one got in. The tint was too dark to see the driver's face, but the car was angled toward my building's entrance at exactly the degree you would choose if you wanted to see who came and went without being obvious about it. Not flashy enough to attract attention. Not old enough to look abandoned. Designed to blend into a residential street, the way a paragraph blends into a page, invisible. Unless you are the kind of person who reads every line. When does coincidence stop being coincidence and become a pattern you were never supposed to notice? I steadied my phone against the windowsill, zoomed until the license plate filled the frame, and pressed the shutter. My hands were shaking, not from the cold March air drifting through the cracked window, but from the growing certainty that whoever was sitting behind that tinted glass already knew exactly where I would be standing and when. I added the photo to the same folder as the airline tickets. 2 entries in receipts. I had a feeling there would be more. I sent the license plate photo to Fiora that night. She texted back 3 words. Prenatal appointment. Tomorrow. Step 1 of her plan had been waiting, and the sedan outside my window made waiting feel like a luxury I could no longer afford. Fiora picked me up at 8 the next morning in her dented Subaru, coffee in the cup holder. No small talk. She drove south toward the clinic in South Burlington with both hands on the wheel and her jaw set, the way it gets when she is thinking faster than she is willing to speak. I sat in the passenger seat with my coat zipped to my chin, one hand in my pocket out of habit, even though the test was no longer there. The habit had stayed. The test was in my bedside drawer. The secret was still mine. The OB/GYN clinic was a low brick building on Dorset Street, with a parking lot that smelled like cold asphalt and the particular stillness of a place where lives begin and end in the same hallway. Fiora walked me to the reception desk, gave my name as if she were delivering a package she had been guarding, and sat in the waiting room with a magazine she did not read. Dr. Harwell, a calm OB/GYN in her mid-50s with silver-streaked hair and steady hands, guided the ultrasound probe across my abdomen without fanfare. The gel was cold. The room was dim. The monitor beside me glowed gray and white, a weather map of a country I had never visited. And then she pointed to a small, bright speck near the center of the screen. 6 weeks, she said. Well-positioned. Healthy gestational sac. Come back in 2 weeks, and we should be able to detect the heartbeat. A 6-week pregnancy is barely anything on a medical chart. A grain of rice, the textbooks say. But it is everything on a scale that measures what you are willing to lose. I stared at that speck of light until my eyes burned. It did not move. It did not flicker. It simply existed, indifferent to divorce papers and surveillance sedans, and the man who had scheduled his departure while I was reheating his dinner. This was not a bargaining chip. This was not a secret I was keeping out of strategy. This was a life, and it had planted itself inside me without asking permission, and I was going to protect it with or without a plan. Dr. Harwell printed 2 copies of the ultrasound image. I folded one into my wallet. The other I handed to Fiora in the hallway. She looked at the grainy printout, then looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "Because once you hear that heartbeat, there is no going back to undecided." I was never undecided, Fiora. I was just afraid to say it out loud. She nodded once, folded the printout into her jacket pocket, and walked beside me toward the clinic exit with her shoulder touching mine. The glass doors opened onto the parking lot, and cold March air hit my face, and I took one breath of it before I saw the car. 2 rows from the entrance. Dark blue Chevrolet. Tinted windows. Engine idling. A thin curl of exhaust rising into the gray afternoon. The same plates I had photographed from my kitchen window 2 days ago. The sedan's engine was running. Whoever was inside had not come to park. They had come to wait. I stopped walking. Fiora took 2 more steps before she felt my absence, turned, and followed my gaze. Her face changed. The color drained from her cheeks the way it drains from a photograph left in sunlight slowly. Then, all at once, "That is the same car," she said. "Same plates," I said. "It was outside my building this morning." Fiora grabbed my wrist. Her grip was tight enough to leave marks, and she did not let go until we were inside her Subaru, with the doors locked and the engine running. She pulled out of the lot without checking her mirrors, which was unlike her, and turned onto Dorset Street, heading north toward Burlington, with both hands white on the steering wheel. The sedan did not follow. It did not need to. It had already confirmed what it came to confirm. Someone now knew where I went for my prenatal care, what time I arrived, and who drove me there. How do you protect a secret when the people hunting for it are already standing outside the room where you confirmed it? I pressed my palm against my wallet where the ultrasound printout was folded. The paper was warm from my body. The image on it was a speck of light the size of a grain of rice, and it was already the most surveilled life in Burlington. Neither of us spoke for 12 minutes. I counted them on the dashboard clock because counting is what I do when the world stops making sense. Then Fiora gripped the steering wheel tighter and said, "That car was not outside your apartment by accident. And it was not outside this clinic by accident. Somebody sent it. And if the Gallaghers already know you are pregnant, the question is not whether they will act." She paused. "It is what they are waiting for." Fiora's question followed me for a week. What are they waiting for? I did not have an answer, but I had step 2 of the plan, and step 2 was a lawyer. So I stopped waiting for the sedan to explain itself and drove to Church Street. I walked into Galilea Goodwin's office, expecting to end my marriage in a week. I walked out understanding that even leaving a man who does not want you takes longer than you think. Galilea Goodwin, 30. A family law attorney with thin-rimmed glasses and a low ponytail who had built her reputation on winning custody cases through evidence rather than theatrics, spread my file across her desk without small talk. Her office was small, meticulous, and smelled like fresh paper and ink. Rain streaked the window behind her. A single mug of coffee sat on the credenza, untouched and cooling. "Walk me through what you want," she said. "Uncontested, no alimony, no disputes. I want a clean separation finalized as quickly as possible." She wrote something in the margin of my intake form without looking up. Vermont requires a minimum 6-month separation period before a divorce can be finalized. The court does not care how ready you feel. 6 months. I had been counting in weeks. I had imagined signing a document, shaking hands with a stranger in a courthouse, and walking into a life where nobody named Gallagher had a claim on my calendar. 6 months meant summer. 6 months meant a belly I could not hide beneath a wool coat. There is a difference between wanting a clean break and deserving one. The law does not care which one you think you are owed, Galilea continued. You listed no shared property, which simplifies things. But your husband is lead systems architect at a family-held tech conglomerate. Even if you are not claiming assets, his side will have counsel reviewing everything. Uncontested only stays uncontested if both parties remain cooperative throughout the separation period. If either side introduces new information or changes terms, we start over. Palmer will cooperate, I said. He wanted this. People who want divorces want them on their terms. Those terms change when the paperwork starts costing money. She flipped to the financial disclosure worksheet. I need you to fill this out completely. Every shared account, every payment made on his behalf, every asset transferred during the marriage. I took the form. I began writing. The numbers came easily because I am the kind of person who remembers every transaction the way other people remember birthdays. 3 years of marriage reduced to a ledger. I wrote down the mortgage contribution, the car insurance, the groceries, and then I reached the line that asked about extraordinary expenditures on behalf of the spouse's family. And I stopped. $47,000. His father's hip replacement and cardiac rehabilitation, paid from my personal savings account, because the insurance copay was more than Palmer could cover, while Gallagher Technologies was restructuring its benefits package. No repayment discussed. No repayment made. I had never said the number out loud before. Writing it on a legal form made the sacrifice feel less noble and more like a receipt for a debt no one had ever acknowledged. Galilea read the number upside down from across the desk. Her pen stopped. You paid $47,000 toward his father's medical expenses from your personal savings, she said. And on the next line, you indicate you declined a director-level transfer to your firm's New York office in order to remain in Burlington at your husband's request. That is correct, and you are asking for nothing in return. She removed her glasses and set them on the desk. Either you are extraordinarily generous, or you are trying to disappear fast enough that the details do not catch up with you. I just want it finished. That is not an answer. She held my gaze. The way people hold fragile objects carefully, with full awareness that pressure in the wrong place would break something. Her pen rested on the worksheet next to the number I had written, and the scratch of that pen on paper had been the only sound in the room for the last 40 minutes, besides the rain. She did not blink. Lawyers who blink are the ones who miss what their clients are hiding. There is something I need to ask you directly, she said. You told me there are no children. You listed no custody considerations. But you paid nearly $50,000 for a man's father, turned down a career-defining promotion, and now you want to walk away with nothing and do it quickly. She paused. Mrs. Gallagher, are you certain there is nothing else I should know? Because if there is, and it surfaces later, it will not be me asking the question. It will be a judge. The ultrasound printout was folded inside my wallet, pressed against my hip. I could feel its outline through the leather, like a second heartbeat. A 6-week-old life captured in grainy gray and white, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, powerful enough to unravel every legal strategy I had just spent an hour building. "There is nothing else," I said. She studied me for 3 more seconds. Then she put her glasses back on, closed the file, and stood. "I will begin drafting the petition. The 6-month clock starts when both parties acknowledge the separation in writing. I will need his attorney's contact by end of week." I nodded. I stood. I placed my hand on the brass doorknob, and the metal was cold against my palm. Her question was still in the air between us, filling the room like smoke from a fire I had started and could not put out. I said nothing and walked out into the April rain. Galilea's question sat in my chest for days like a stone I had swallowed and could not dissolve. "Are you certain there is nothing else?" I was not certain, but I was committed. And commitment is just certainty with worse lighting. The following Monday, a new senior analyst transferred in from the Denver office, and for reasons I could not explain, that small act of ordinary corporate reshuffling unsettled me more than anything Palmer had done in weeks. Knox Sherwood, 32, a senior operations analyst with broad shoulders and a quiet voice, walked into our Burlington office on his first morning, carrying a notepad with 12 coffee orders written in neat block letters. He had called the front desk the Friday before and asked the receptionist for every team member's name and usual order. By 9:15, he had placed a warm oat milk latte on my desk without introduction, without fanfare, without the performative charm of a man trying to make an impression. He was simply a person who had decided to pay attention, and the efficiency of it startled me. Within his first week, Knox quietly reassigned every field travel client visit off my calendar I noticed on Wednesday when 2 site meetings I had confirmed vanished from the shared schedule and reappeared under a junior associate's name. By Thursday, my entire April was remote work financial modeling, document analysis, risk assessments. Nothing that required a rental car, a highway, or a full day standing on my feet. Kindness from a stranger is the most disorienting thing in the world when you have spent surrounded by people who claim to love you and cannot be bothered to stay. I confronted him Friday afternoon, standing in his office doorway with my arms crossed and my calendar open on my phone. "You reassigned every client visit off my schedule. I am not fragile, Mr. Sherwood." He did not stand. He did not flinch. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands the way a man does when his answer is already prepared. "I am not treating you as fragile. I am putting the best modeler on the core deliverables and sending the associates out to build field experience. Your risk assessment framework from last quarter is the reason we won the Montpellier contract. I need that brain at a desk, not in a rental car on I-89. His reasoning was airtight. His logic was professional. And he had been here 5 days and already knew which contract I had led. Nobody studies a colleague's portfolio that carefully, unless they are paying a kind of attention that has nothing to do with spreadsheets. "If you need anything," he said as I turned to leave, "just say, no explanation required." I did not say anything. I walked back to my desk with the oat milk latte still warm beside my keyboard and tried to remember the last time someone had offered help without attaching a condition to it. The following afternoon, Fiora was unavailable to drive me to my follow-up appointment. I stepped outside my apartment building, reached for my phone to open the rideshare app, and stopped. The car was already there. I had not called it. I had not typed a single letter. A silver sedan idled at the curb, its window lowered 2 inches. The driver was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair and the kind of stillness that comes from practice rather than calm. He leaned toward the gap in the window. "Honora," he said. "South Burlington, the medical plaza on Dorset Street." My hand was still on my phone. The app was still closed. He knew my name. He knew the address. He knew the destination before I had told anyone I was going. Yes. How did you know? "App dispatched me early," he said. "Happens sometimes." It does not happen sometimes. I have used rideshare services for 3 years, and never once has a car arrived before the request was placed. But I was running late, and the clinic was 20 minutes south, and the alternative was standing on the sidewalk trying to understand something I did not have time to understand. So I got in. The interior was clean. Not lived-in clean, chemically clean, the way a recently detailed rental smells when someone wants it to look like it belongs to no one. The seatbelt pulled tight across my midsection, tighter than it should have been, and I adjusted it without thinking about why. The driver said nothing for the entire ride. His eyes stayed on the rearview mirror, not checking traffic, not glancing at the GPS, checking me. I counted the number of times his gaze flicked to the mirror. 11 times in 17 minutes, and each time his expression did not change. He was not curious. He was recording. Being watched is not a single feeling. It is a slow leak in a room you cannot find the source of, until the floor beneath you is already soaked. We pulled into the clinic parking lot. I unbuckled, opened the door, and stepped onto the asphalt. The driver did not pull away. He sat at the curb with the engine running, watching me walk through the glass doors. When I glanced back from the lobby, he was writing something in a small leather-bound notebook, resting on his steering wheel. His pen moved in short, deliberate strokes, the handwriting of a man who had done this many times before. I made it to the reception desk before the thought fully formed. He was not waiting for another fare. I was logging where I went. I told no one about the driver and the notebook. Not Fiora, not Galilea. I added it to the file in my head, alongside the sedan and the silent calls. And I carried that file into the divorce, signing the way a soldier carries a sidearm, hoping not to use it, knowing it was there. Palmer sat on one side of Galilea's conference table, and I sat on the other. And between us lay a stack of paper that weighed less than a pound, but carried the entire mass of 3 years. Galilea opened with procedural terms. She explained the separation acknowledgement, the asset division waiver, the timeline for court review. Palmer's attorney, a quiet man in a gray suit who had introduced himself and immediately become invisible, nodded along. Palmer sat with his hands folded and his Mont Blanc pen resting beside the documents, and he had the look of a man who expected this to be quick and painless. I did not let it be either. Before Palmer could speak, before his attorney could guide us to the first signature line, I placed both hands flat on the table and began. "January 2021, I said. $47,000 from my personal savings to cover your father's hip replacement and cardiac rehabilitation. The insurance copay exceeded what you could cover while the company restructured its benefits. No repayment discussed, no repayment offered. I checked the bank statements last week. The balance is still 0. Palmer's pen did not move. His eyes dropped to the table. There is a particular kind of power in knowing every number by heart. Not because you kept score, but because you were the only one paying. February through April 2021. 14 nights sleeping in a hospital recliner beside your father's bed because your mother's back could not handle the chairs and you were traveling for the company. I ate cafeteria soup at 11 at night and drove to work at 6 in the morning, and you called once to ask how he was doing. Once. His jaw tightened. The gray-suited attorney shifted in his chair. September 2022. My managing director called to offer me the New York transfer. Senior analyst position. Corner office. 30% raise. I turned it down in the parking lot before I even got home, because you told me you could never leave Burlington. I paused. You were already booking flights to Portland by then, were you not? His pen stopped. That was the line that broke something behind his eyes. Good. Now he knew what it felt like to watch an opportunity disappear because someone else decided for you. Thanksgiving 2020, 2021, 2022. 3 years of cooking for your parents while you worked late on projects that apparently included planning your departure. Your mother's sweet potato recipe. Your father's bourbon preference. I learned both because that is what you do when you marry into a family. You learn their recipes. You learn their habits. You become part of the architecture, and then you discover the architect was planning to demolish the building the whole time. Palmer's cologne reached me across the table. The same brand I had bought him last Christmas, wrapped in gold paper, placed under a tree I had decorated alone because he was in Portland. The smell of it now made my stomach turn. Sign the page, Palmer. He picked up the pen. His hand was steady, but his breathing was not. He signed the first page, then the second, then the third. Galilea turned each document toward him with the precision of a dealer laying cards, and he signed every one without a word of defense. I did not drink water. My mouth was dry from speaking for 40 minutes, and the dryness tasted like the ghost of every word I had swallowed instead of screaming. But I did not drink, because drinking would have been a pause, and a pause would have given him room to respond. And I was not finished. The last page. He signed it. He set the pen down. He looked at me. Honora, please, he said. I need you to know that. I stood. I buttoned my coat. I walked to the door and pulled it open and stepped through without turning around. The click of the latch behind me was the softest sound I had ever heard, and it ended our marriage. Closing that door was the easiest thing I had done in 3 years, and the hardest thing I would carry for the rest of my life. I pressed my back against the hallway wall and exhaled for the first time in 40 minutes. The building was quiet. Church Street traffic hummed through the old windows. I stood there with my coat buttoned and my hands at my sides, and I did not cry, because crying would have meant the performance was over. And I was not ready to stop being the woman who had walked in there with every number memorized and every sentence loaded. My phone vibrated against my palm. Not Fiora, not Galilea. A news alert from a Burlington tech journal I had subscribed to years ago, when Palmer's career still felt like mine. The headline read, Gallagher Technologies announces strategic alliance with Whitfield Crane Industries. Founding families to formalize partnership. Below the headline was a photograph. Palmer standing beside a woman I had never seen. Dark hair, tailored blazer, a smile that looked like it had been approved by a publicist. The caption beneath it read, Palmer Gallagher and his fiancée, Cecily Whitfield Crane. I read the word fiancé 3 times. The ink on our separation papers was still wet on the table behind that door, and he was already someone else's future. I stood in that hallway staring at the photograph, until my phone screen dimmed. Palmer in a charcoal suit. A woman with dark hair and a publicist's smile. The word fiancé. The article was dated 2 days before I signed the papers. I drove to Winooski. Fiora was at her kitchen table with a mug of chamomile tea and a half-finished illustration when I set my phone in front of her. Screen up. Article open. She read the headline. She read the caption. Then she pulled her laptop across the table, opened the article's source page, and started clicking. Look at the published date, she said. April 12th. You signed on the 14th. They announced you were gone before you even agreed to leave. I sat across from her and pressed my fingernails into my palms until I could feel the crescents forming. The cottage smelled like dried lavender and chamomile gone cold, and it was the only place in the world that felt safe enough to say what I was about to say. 2 years, I said. He knew for 2 years. He let me cover his father's surgery. He let me turn down New York. He let me sleep in hospital recliners and cook his mother's recipes and redecorate a house he was planning to leave. All while they had already chosen her. Fiora closed the laptop slowly. The way you close a book when the ending is worse than you expected. This was never a marriage falling apart, she said. It was a contract expiring. How do you mourn a marriage when you discover it was decommissioned on a spreadsheet before the person inside it even knew? I did not mourn. I drove home. I sat in my apartment with the takeout containers from 2 nights ago still untouched on the counter. And I picked up my phone, and I called the number I had not dialed since the morning Palmer told me he was exhausted. He answered on the second ring. He did not say hello. He said my name, and the way he said it quietly, like a man who had been expecting this call and dreading it in equal measure, told me he had already seen the article and knew I had seen it too. April 12th, Palmer, I said. The article went live 2 days before I signed. Did you know when you sat across from me in that office? A long pause. Not the silence of a man composing a lie. The silence of a man deciding whether he was brave enough to tell the truth. Yes, he said. He said yes. No pause long enough to be a lie. No stammer long enough to be shame. Just yes. The partnership with Whitfield Crane Industries, I said. The woman in the photograph. How long? Honora, you have to understand. The family decided this long before either of us had a say. I tried to. Did you fight it? Silence. Not the 4-second silence of the anonymous phone calls. Not the 72-hour silence of our Cold War. This was the silence of a man who had reached the edge of a confession and found nothing beneath his feet but air. Palmer, did you fight it? More silence. And then, behind him, a sound that rearranged everything I thought I understood about this phone call and this family and this marriage. A voice. Male. Older. Stern in the way that expensive authority is always stern, not loud, not raised. Just absolutely certain of its right to interrupt. Palmer. One word. One syllable of his name. Spoken the way you would speak to an employee who had wandered into a room he was not cleared to enter. That voice in the background was not a father calling his son. It was a chairman recalling a subordinate who had spoken out of turn. Palmer's breathing changed. I heard it through the phone, the sharp inhale of a man who had been caught. Not by me, but by someone whose disapproval carried consequences I could not yet see. I am sorry, he whispered. The line went dead. I held the phone against my ear for 10 seconds after the call ended. Listening to nothing, the silence on his end sounded exactly like the silence in our house during those last 3 days. The silence of a man who wanted to speak and had been told he was not allowed to. Palmer had not ended the call. Someone had ended it for him. And the voice that did it belonged to a man who had been running his family the way he ran his company, with directives, timelines, and the absolute expectation that no one in the building would deviate from the plan. Emmett Gallagher, 62 years old, founding chairman of Gallagher Technologies, Palmer's father, the man whose medical bills I had paid from my savings, while he was apparently deciding which woman his son would marry next. I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and placed both hands on the edge. The adrenaline tasted like metal at the back of my throat, and my pulse was louder than the refrigerator hum and the street noise combined. The next thought that arrived was not about Palmer. It was not about the article or the woman in the photograph or the word fiancé printed beneath a corporate smile. It was about the sedan, the driver with the leather notebook, the silent phone calls, the ride share that arrived before I opened the app. If Emmett had controlled the marriage, the divorce, and the new bride, then the driver with the leather notebook worked for him too. And if the driver worked for Emmett, then Emmett already knew where I went for prenatal care. If Emmett controlled the sedan, then Emmett knew about the clinic. And if Emmett knew about the clinic, then the secret I had been carrying in my coat pocket and my bedside drawer and my wallet had never been mine to keep. I drove to Church Street the next morning with every piece of evidence I had collected. I walked into Galilea's office with a folder containing the partnership article, the license plate screenshot, and a list of every date the silent calls had come. Before I could set any of it on her desk, she lowered her reading glasses, looked at me over the rims, and said 5 words that stopped me cold. "You were pregnant before signing. It was not a question." She said it the way she said everything precisely, without inflection. The way a surgeon names the organ before cutting. I did not answer immediately. I set the folder down. I sat in the chair across from her. Morning light came through the Church Street blinds in thin horizontal lines that fell across the conference table like bars. 6 weeks, I said, at the time of the signing, and you disclosed this to neither party nor the court. No. Galilea tapped her pen once against the desk. One tap. The sound was small and deliberate, and it carried the weight of everything she had been holding back since the first time I sat in that chair and told her there were no children. "I suspected from our first meeting," she said. "The outline of an ultrasound printout was visible through the leather of your wallet when you opened it to find your insurance card. You avoided every question I asked about dependents, and you wanted the fastest possible exit from a marriage where you had sacrificed nearly $50,000 without asking for a cent in return. That is not generosity. That is a woman running. There is a particular cruelty in discovering that the secret you carried to protect your child was never a secret at all. It was just a vulnerability you handed to the other side, gift-wrapped in silence. I thought keeping it private protected the baby," I said. "Keeping it private protected your pride," Galilea said. She poured black coffee from a carafe on the credenza without asking if I wanted any. The coffee was bitter and lukewarm, the taste of a conversation neither of us wanted to have. "The baby needs a legal fortress, not a secret." She sat back down and opened the folder I had brought. She read the article headline. She studied the license plate photo. She scanned the list of call dates. And then she set it all aside and looked at me with the expression of an attorney who has stopped reviewing evidence and started assessing risk. "If the Gallagher side discovers the concealed pregnancy before you declare it voluntarily, they can argue material concealment. the entire settlement becomes vulnerable to reopening. Custody becomes a battlefield you enter already losing. Custody, I repeated. The word tasted different now than it had a month ago. A month ago, it was hypothetical. Now, it was the only word that mattered. A supplemental declaration filed proactively tells the court you disclosed voluntarily and in good faith. It removes their strongest weapon, the argument that you hid a material fact to manipulate the outcome, and it hands them the information they need to come after custody. When does protecting your child stop being about keeping them hidden and start being about making sure the world knows exactly who will fight for them? Galilea leaned forward. A driver who knew your clinic address before you booked the ride. A sedan that has followed you to prenatal appointments. They may already have this information. The question is not whether they know. The question is whether you control the narrative, or they do. I sat with that for a long time. The street noise from Church Street filtered through the old windows' car doors, voices, the distant clang of a delivery truck, and it sounded like a city that did not know or care that a woman on the second floor was deciding how to protect her child from people with more money and more lawyers and more patience than she had. I will declare it, I said. But I prepare first. I secure my lease. I build a savings buffer. I document every instance of surveillance. And then I file on my terms. They will not move before me. Galilea nodded. For the first time since I had known her, something shifted behind her eyes that might have been respect. I had spent weeks thinking like a woman with a secret. Galilea taught me in 45 minutes to think like a mother with a strategy. I gathered my things and stood. Galilea turned to her laptop and typed something into a search bar. I was halfway to the door when she said, "One moment." She had pulled up the Vermont Secretary of State's business registry. On the screen was a company filing I had never seen. She had typed in the license plate number from my photograph and cross-referenced it through the state's vehicle registration database. The sedan is registered to a company called Granite Ridge Consulting, LLC, she said. Single-member entity. Its registered agent is listed as Virgil Brooks. She scrolled down. And its sole corporate client, disclosed in a state filing from 2021, is Gallagher Technologies. The driver had a name. The company had a client. And the client was the man whose voice had cut Palmer's confession short the night before. I walked out of Galilea's office into the May morning with 3 things I did not have when I walked in. A name, a strategy, and the understanding that my secret had never been a shield. It had been a target. I spent the next month preparing. I secured a 12-month lease renewal on my apartment. I opened a separate savings account and began funneling every spare dollar into it. I documented every sighting of the sedan dates, times, locations, in a spreadsheet. Galilea could present to a court. And through all of it, Virgil Brooks sat in his dark blue Chevrolet across my street, like a man clocking in for a shift. Then, in June, Knox Sherwood was sitting in the waiting room of my OB/GYN's office when I arrived for my 5-month checkup. Not reading his phone, not pretending to be casual, just sitting there with 2 water bottles on the chair beside him and his work bag at his feet, as if he had been there for a while and intended to stay. "How did you know about this appointment?" I said. "You blocked 2 hours on the shared calendar and labeled it medical," he said. "I did not ask what kind. I just asked myself if you had someone to drive you." He did not ask about the pregnancy. He did not ask whose baby it was. He did not scan my belly or glance at my chart or do any of the things a man does when he is gathering information. He handed me a water bottle. Cold, clean, the simplest kindness anyone had offered me in months, and walked me to his car. There are two kinds of men who show up without being asked: the ones who want you to know they came, and the ones who would have come whether you noticed or not. Knox was the second kind, and that was precisely what made him dangerous to the armor I had spent 3 months building. He drove me to the clinic. He waited in the lobby through the entire appointment. The ultrasound showed a healthy boy, measuring exactly on schedule, and when the heartbeat filled the small room like a drum being played underwater, I pressed my hand against my visible bump and realized it was the first time I had done this in front of another person besides Fiora and Dr. Harwell. On the drive home, Knox talked only about the Montpellier deliverable and a schedule adjustment he had made to give me breathing room. His car smelled like cedar and clean leather. Folk music played low on the radio. He gave me space I did not ask for but desperately needed. Before I tell you what I discovered that evening, the detail that finally explained why Emmett had been watching me for months without making a move. Are you still with me? Comment your guess. What do you think he was waiting for? Drop it in one sentence. A quick note: the next part includes some fictionalized details to deepen the emotional impact. The message behind it is what matters. Knox dropped me at my apartment. I thanked him without looking at his face, because looking at his face had started to feel like a risk I could not afford. He pulled away, and I turned toward my building entrance and stopped. The sedan. Parked across the street. Same plates. Engine running. I went inside, locked the door, and called Fiora. She arrived at 7 with her phone in her hand and a look on her face that told me she had already confirmed what I suspected. She set the phone on the kitchen counter and showed me a registration document she had obtained through a contact at the State House. Granite Ridge Consulting, she said. 1 employee, 1 client. Virgil Brooks has been on Gallagher Technologies security retainer since October 2021. October 2021. 6 months before the Cold War. 6 months before the silence. They were watching me before there was anything to watch. That is 6 months before your marriage even started falling apart, Fiora said. He was not hired because of the divorce. He was hired because of you. Because at some point, Emmett Gallagher decided you were a variable worth monitoring. They have watched every appointment, I said. Every clinic visit. They know about the pregnancy. They have known for months, Fiora said. She picked up the cold tea I had left on the counter that morning, looked at it, and set it back down. The question is not whether they know. It is why they have not done anything about it yet. I stood at the window after she left. The sedan sat beneath the streetlight, motionless. The driver, Virgil Brooks, now that I had a name for the shadow, did not move. He knew I was looking. He did not leave. If a man like Emmett Gallagher knows you are carrying his grandchild and chooses to do nothing, what exactly is he waiting for you to do first? The answer came to me at 2 a.m. while I lay in the dark with my hand on my stomach and the streetlight leaking through the curtains. Emmett had not moved because moving required a trigger. A birth certificate, a filing, a name on a document that gave his lawyers something concrete to contest. He was not ignoring the pregnancy. He was waiting for it to become a child with legal standing, a surname, a custody claim he could file against. I was letting me do the hard part. And then he would take it. I did not sleep. I lay there counting the weeks until my due date. The way I count everything precisely, methodically, and understood for the first time that the clock I was racing against was not Galilea's filing deadline. It was Emmett's patience. I carried that understanding through the rest of the summer, that Emmett was waiting for a birth certificate, not a belly, and I prepared for both the baby and the battle with the same spreadsheet precision I brought to every client portfolio. The contractions started at 11 on a Tuesday night in September. By the time Fiora's headlights swept across my apartment windows at midnight, I was already on the kitchen floor, holding the counter with both hands and counting the seconds between waves, like data points on a chart I could not control. Fiora drove with her hands shaking on the wheel and jasmine perfume filling the car, and not a single word spoken between us, because there was nothing to say that the situation was not already saying louder. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and fluorescent light, and the particular urgency of a building that never sleeps. They put me in a delivery room and hooked me to a fetal monitor, and the beeping accelerated with every contraction, like a metronome that had lost its discipline. Fiora held my hand. Her grip trembled, but she did not let go. The nurse handed me ice chips between contractions, and they tasted like nothing and everything at the same time. Because my body was doing something ancient and enormous, and my mind was still trying to turn it into numbers. They tell you the first cry is the moment everything changes, but that is not true. The moment everything changes is the silence right before it, when you are still the only person who knows his name. Elio arrived at 3:07 a.m. 7 pounds, silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then he filled the delivery room with a cry that I would remember as the first sound of my new life. Raw, indignant, impossibly loud for something so small. They placed him on my chest, and his weight was nothing and everything. His face was red and scrunched, and his fingers curled against my collarbone, and I cried without realizing it, until Fiora wiped the tears from my cheek with her thumb. The nurse came with the birth certificate paperwork. She held the pen and asked the question I had rehearsed for months. Last name for the certificate? Gleason, I said. Fiora squeezed my hand. Good. Elio Gleason. Not Gallagher. He would carry my name into the world, not theirs. That was the first boundary line I drew, one that could not be erased without a court order and a fight I was now fully prepared to give them. Knox appeared in the doorway at 4 a.m, still in a wrinkled shirt, hair uncombed, 2 coffee cups in his hands. He had driven from his apartment in the dark without being called, without being told, without knowing anything, except that I had not shown up for work, and that was enough. Coffee for Fiora, he said. Decaf for you. I will be in the hallway if you need anything. No rush. He did not step inside. He did not look at the baby. He stood at the threshold and offered what he always offered presents, without pressure. And then he disappeared down the corridor. The decaf was weak and lukewarm. It was the kindest thing I had tasted in months. What I did not know, what I would learn later through Galilea's legal channels, was what happened at Gallagher Technologies headquarters 3 days after the birth. Palmer stormed into Emmett's corner office on a Friday afternoon. Emmett Gallagher, 62, founding chairman of a tech conglomerate that bore his name and bent to his will, was sitting behind his desk, reviewing quarterly projections when his son threw open the door. She had my child and you knew? Palmer said. His voice cracked. For months you knew and you said nothing to me? Emmett did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He turned his leather chair slightly away from the window and looked at his son the way a man looks at a subordinate who has interrupted a meeting. I said nothing because you would have done something sentimental and ruined the position. Emmett had known since the first ultrasound, every clinic visit logged, every trimester tracked. He had watched my pregnancy like a quarterly earnings report, and now the asset had been delivered. A pregnancy is speculation, Emmett said. A birth certificate is a document. The child is here now. Leave this to me. What are you going to do? Palmer asked. Emmett turned back to his desk. What I have always done, Palmer. Protect the family name. Whether its mother cooperates or not. A man who waits 9 months to act is not patient. He is a predator who understands that the prey is easier to corner. Once it is holding something, it cannot put down. 3 days after Elio was born, while I was still learning how to nurse him in the blue half-light of my bedroom at 4 in the morning, my phone lit up on the nightstand. The screen glowed against the dark ceiling. A text from a number I did not recognize. This is Louise Gallagher. I need to speak with you before my husband does. Please do not tell Palmer. There is a park bench at the north end of Oakledge. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Come alone. I read it twice with Elio asleep on my chest, his breath warm against my collarbone. Palmer's the woman who had eaten every Thanksgiving dinner I cooked and never once warned me what her husband was planning. Now she wanted to talk. And she wanted to do it before Emmett made his move. The envelope was ivory linen, heavy enough that I felt it before I saw it propped against my apartment door at 7 in the morning. No postmark, no mail carrier. Hand-delivered in the dark, like a warning someone wanted me to find before breakfast. I did not open it right away. I knew what it was. 3 weeks earlier, a woman I had never met in person had told me exactly what was coming. And she had been right about every detail except the color of the paper. The meeting at Oakledge Park had been Louise Gallagher's idea. She texted from a number I did not recognize, 2 sentences and no greeting. I am Palmer's mother. Meet me at the north bench at Oakledge tomorrow at 10 a.m. and tell no one. I almost deleted it. Then I read it again and noticed the period after every sentence deliberate, careful. The punctuation of a woman who proofread even her secrets. Louise Gallagher was 58 years old, a former hospital fundraising coordinator who had spent 3 decades as the silent wife of Emmett Gallagher. She sat on the park bench wearing sunglasses she did not need and a wool coat buttoned to the throat like armor. Her hands were clasped in her lap so tightly the knuckles had gone white. Lake Champlain lapped against the shoreline behind us, and the air smelled of wet leaves and cold water, the particular scent of a Vermont autumn that makes everything feel like it is ending. He does not want visitation, Honora, she said before I had fully sat down. Her voice was low and rehearsed, as if she had practiced this speech in a locked bathroom. He wants the name. The child carries Gleason on the certificate, and Emmett considers that a theft from the family line. Visitation is the door, custody is the room behind it. I watched her eyes dart to the parking lot, then back. Why are you telling me this? Because I spent 30 years watching him do to Palmer what he is about to do to your son, she said. I will not watch it happen twice. Louise Gallagher had lived inside that family for 3 decades, and the bravest thing she had ever done was sit on a park bench and tell a near stranger the truth. And even that she did looking over her shoulder. She told me Emmett had retained attorneys connected to the Whitfield Crane family. She told me the filing would come disguised as a grandparent visitation request. She told me the language would reference heritage and resources, words designed to sound benevolent in front of a judge while meaning something entirely different behind closed doors. Then she stood, gripped my wrist once brief, firm, the pressure of someone who wanted to say more but could not afford to, and said, "You have maybe 3 weeks before the filing. Use them, and please do not contact me again on this number. He monitors everything." She walked to her car without looking back. I sat on that bench for 20 minutes after she left, listening to the lake and feeling autumn settle into my coat like a second skin. 3 weeks. She had been precise. The ivory envelope confirmed every word. I carried it inside, set Elio in his bassinet where his breathing stayed soft, and even the only calm sound in the apartment, and slid my thumb under the seal. The paper inside was thick, embossed with a law firm letterhead I did not recognize. I read it standing at the kitchen counter with cold coffee reheated for the 3rd time that morning, bitter and thin against my tongue, requesting structured visitation to ensure the minor child's connection to paternal heritage, supported by the Gallagher family's established resources and generational stability. Heritage and stability. 2 words that meant nothing about a child's well-being and everything about a family's pride. They were not coming for Elio because they loved him. They were coming for him because his last name was wrong. I called Galilea before I finished the 2nd paragraph. She answered on the first ring, which told me she had been expecting this call, the way oncologists expect lab results, not hoping for good news, just ready to work with whatever arrived. I read the letter aloud, my voice steady in a way that surprised me. Galilea listened without interrupting until I reached the phrase, superior resources, heritage and stability, she repeated. That is custody language dressed in a greeting card. They filed exactly as Louise predicted. Visitation first, then they escalate to a fitness hearing. How do we stop it? We file our counter motion this week, she said, and I could hear her already pulling files, already building, the surveillance logs, the sedan, all of it. They built a case watching you. We built one watching them. There is a moment. Every mother reaches where fear stops being an emotion and becomes a material something, hard and sharp, you can hold in your hand and use. I reached it standing in that kitchen, holding a letter that smelled faintly of expensive cologne, as if cruelty came with its own fragrance. They are coming for my son, I said. They are, Galilea answered. And they have just made the mistake of telling us exactly how. I hung up and carried Elio to the window. His small fist curled around my index finger as I looked down at the street. The dark sedan was gone. For the first time in months, the space beneath the streetlight was empty. That should have been a relief. Instead, it terrified me, because the driver had no reason to watch anymore. They had everything they needed. The next time I saw the Gallagher name, it would be on a court filing with my son's future printed inside it. The sedan never came back. For 2 weeks after the custody petition arrived, I checked the street below my window every morning while Elio nursed, scanning the curb for a dark hood and a patient engine. The space stayed empty. Whatever came next would not arrive on wheels. It arrived on foot. I was strapping Elio into his car seat after his 2-month checkup when a man stepped out from behind the hospital pillar and said my name. I knew his face before I knew why the same quiet eyes I had watched in a rearview mirror half a year ago. The same hands that had gripped a steering wheel while I sat in the back seat, pretending I did not notice him logging every mile of my pregnancy. Virgil Brooks, 45 years old. a private security contractor who had spent 9 months as a shadow in a dark sedan, and who now stood in the November parking lot light, looking like a man returning something that did not belong to him. "You drove me to my own prenatal appointment," I said. My voice was flat. Elio squirmed beneath the chest clip. "You sat outside and wrote down where I went." "Yes," he said. No excuse, no softening. "Why are you here now?" He reached into his coat and pulled out the leather-bound notebook I had glimpsed once through a windshield-creased pages, blue ink, the particular wear of something carried every day for months. He held it out the way a man holds something he is ashamed to have carried. "Because I have a daughter," he said. "And what I did to you is not something I want to explain to her." There is a strange mercy in watching a man hand you the record of his own wrongdoing, because in that moment, the power shifts without a single word being raised. I took the logbook because refusing evidence out of pride is a luxury mothers cannot afford. I opened it in the car while Elio slept. Every trip, every clinic visit, every drive to Fiora's cottage, dates, times, mileage. 9 months of my life. Reduced to blue ink and grid lines, the handwriting careful and small, the observations clinical. He had noted my weight gain by trimester. He had recorded the duration of each appointment. On one page, in slightly larger letters, he had written a single annotation beside a late August entry. "She is due within 3 weeks." The logbook smelled of old leather and ink, the scent of months of watching compressed into 100 pages. I closed it and pressed my palms flat against the cover until my pulse slowed. 4 days later, Palmer texted. No greeting, just an address, a cafe on Pearl Street I had never been to, which meant he had chosen it because neither of us had history there. Neutral ground. I left Elio with Fiora and went. He looked like a man who had not slept in a week. His coffee sat untouched, and when he reached across the table to shake my hand, brief, uncertain. The first time we had touched since the divorce, his fingers trembled. "I watched my father turn me into a product," he said. No preamble, no small talk. The cafe noise, clinking cups, low conversation filled the space where warmth used to be. I am not going to sit here and watch him do it to a child who does not even know my name yet. Then you accept help from the man who broke your life open, if accepting it is the only way to keep your son from being broken the same way? I sat with that question for 10 seconds. That felt like 10 minutes. "You knew about the surveillance," I said. "I found out after the birth. There are emails from my father to the driver, to the attorneys, to the Whitfield Cranes, directives, timelines, all of it. And you are willing to give them to me?" His hands tightened around the cup he had not drunk from. "I will send you what my father never wanted anyone to see." Palmer, sitting across that cafe table, was not the man who had signed papers in Galilea's office 7 months ago. He was the aftermath of a man who had finally seen the machine he was built inside and decided to throw himself into the gears. I did not trust him. I was not sure I would ever trust him again. But a man offering to burn down his father's empire to protect a son he had never held, that was not performance. That was a line he would not cross. I ordered coffee. I barely touched too bitter, too ordinary for a conversation, this heavy, and left without making any promises. That night, after Elio was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with Virgil's logbook open on one side and my phone on the other. At 11:47, Palmer's email arrived. No subject line, just an attachment. I opened it and found myself reading a chain of 14 internal emails between Emmett and 3 attorneys, dated from October 2021 to September 2023, with one recurring subject header that turned my stomach before I finished the first line. Succession Protocol Contingency. Female asset produces heir. I was the female asset, and my son was the heir they had been planning for before I even knew I was pregnant. I read every email 3 times, not because the language was complicated, but because I needed to make sure the rage building behind my ribs was based on facts and not on the version of events my exhausted, postpartum brain might have invented at midnight. The facts held. They were worse than I remembered. I spread Virgil's logbook open on the kitchen table beside my laptop and began matching dates. The screen glowed in the dark apartment while Elio slept in the next room, his breathing soft through the cracked door, the only gentle sound in a night that had turned into an excavation. I started with the earliest email, dated October 14th, 2021, and worked forward. October 2021. Emmett to Virgil Brooks. Begin baseline documentation on H. Gallagher. Weekly location patterns, professional contacts, financial behaviors. Standard retention protocol. I turned to the logbook. October 18, 2021. First entry. 4 days between the directive and the execution. I was still buying Emmett's birthday gifts that month. I was still calling Palmer's mother to coordinate Thanksgiving seating. I was still a wife, performing the ordinary rituals of a family that had already decided I was an asset to be cataloged. I moved to April 2023. Emmett to legal counsel. Female asset confirmed pregnant per clinic surveillance. Do not inform PG. Await delivery for maximum procedural leverage. Female asset. That is what I was. Not a wife. Not a mother. Not even a name. An asset classified, monitored, and depreciated on a schedule someone else controlled. He had turned my body into a timetable. My pregnancy into a business quarter. My son into a line item in a succession protocol that existed before the child had a heartbeat. I cross-referenced every email against the logbook. 14 emails, 23 months. The dates aligned within 72 hours on every single entry, a directive from Emmett, followed by a logged trip from Virgil, followed by a report filed back through the chain. Every mile I drove, every doctor I visited, every night I spent at Fiora's cottage, believing I was invisible, catalogued, timestamped, and filed under a protocol that treated my son as an inheritance contingency. The earliest surveillance predated the divorce by well over a year. That fact sat in my chest like a stone. Emmett had not reacted to the pregnancy. He had not reacted to the separation. He had been building a file on me since the autumn of 2021, when Palmer and I were still sharing a bed and arguing about nothing more serious than whose turn it was to call the plumber. The monitoring was never about custody. It was about positioning, making sure that whatever I produced, whenever I produced it, the dynasty would be ready to claim it. What kind of man surveils his own daughter-in-law for 23 months and calls it family planning? I called Galilea at 6 in the morning. She answered on the second ring, already awake, and I read the key passages aloud in a voice that stayed level only because I had spent 6 hours rehearsing it in my head. The stale remains of last night's tea sat cold beside the logbook. My tongue tasted of sleeplessness and metal. Read me the October 2021 email again, Galilea said. The exact phrasing, I read it. She was silent for 4 seconds. That is not a custody concern, she said. That is corporate intelligence gathering on a private citizen. No judge in Chittenden County will read this as parental interest. The logbook matches, I said. Every directive, every logged trip within 3 days, every time. That is not circumstantial, Galilea said, and I could hear her pulling files, the rustle of paper behind her measured voice. That is a documented chain of command. Emmett ordered it. The driver executed it. And Palmer just handed us the receipts. Emmett had built a fortress of silence and surveillance around me. And his own son had handed me the blueprints. Every door, every lock, every blind spot where the walls were thinnest. We have it, I said. We have more than it, Galilea answered. We have a pattern of surveillance, a motive tied to inheritance, and internal language that refers to the mother of the child as a female asset. I will file the counter-motion by Friday. They will not recover from this. She hung up to begin drafting. I sat at the kitchen table with the logbook and emails spread before me like a war map, the early morning light creeping across the pages, turning Virgil's blue ink golden at the edges. Elio stirred in the next room. I listened to him settle, his small sounds filling the apartment the way they always did, effortlessly, completely, as if silence was something he simply refused to allow. Then my phone buzzed once more against the wooden table. Not Galilea, not Palmer. Louise's burner number. 4 words on the screen. He knows Palmer talked. I stared at the message and understood immediately. The counter-motion had to be filed before Emmett could reach into his own servers and scrub the trail clean. Friday was not soon enough. Nothing was soon enough. The race had just changed from a legal strategy to a sprint against a man who had spent 30 years making evidence disappear before anyone thought to look for it. Galilea filed the counter-motion 41 hours after Louise's warning. Not Friday, Wednesday morning, before the courthouse coffee had finished brewing. She told me later she had not slept. I believed her, because I had not slept either. And when we walked into Chittenden County Family Court on a frozen January morning, we both moved with the brittle energy of women running on conviction and caffeine. Emmett Gallagher sat 12 feet from me in that sealed courtroom, and for the first time since I had known him, he was not the most powerful person in the room. Judge Alderman was. She was silver-haired, early 60s, and had presided over family cases in this county for 19 years. She entered through the side door with the kind of quiet authority that made expensive attorneys sit up straighter. The courtroom was wood-paneled and windowless, overhead lights casting flat white across both tables. No gallery. Sealed proceedings. Just the families, the attorneys, and the judge who would decide my son's future. The Gallagher legal team opened first. Their lead attorney, a tall man in a navy suit who spoke the way people speak when they are billing by the quarter hour, built an argument I could have written in my sleep. Heritage. Stability. Community roots stretching back 3 generations. The Gallagher family's capacity to provide. The child's best interest. Watching him describe heritage and stability was like watching a man polish the outside of a building while the foundation paperwork showed it was built on someone else's land. Every word sounded reasonable. Every sentence was engineered to make a grandmother's desire to hold her grandchild seem like the most natural request in the world. And Galilea sat beside me with her hand resting flat on the counter-motion folder, thick, tabbed, untouched, and let them build the tallest tower they could. Because what she had inside that folder would bring every floor down at once. Palmer sat across the aisle. He did not look at his father. His hands were folded, and his jaw was set, and I could not tell if the tension in his shoulders was guilt or grief or both. Emmett sat in charcoal, perfectly still, watching the proceedings the way a chairman watches a quarterly earnings call, as if the outcome was already decided, and this was merely the presentation. Then Galilea stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture. She opened the folder and began reading a timeline date by date, email by email, logbook entry by logbook entry. She started in October 2021 and worked forward with the patience of a woman who understood that precision was more devastating than volume. When she reached the April 2023 email, she slowed down. Your Honor, I would like to read from an internal communication dated April 3, 2023, from the petitioner to his private security contractor, she said. Her voice was clear enough that every syllable landed separately. Quote, female asset confirmed pregnant per clinic surveillance. Do not inform PG. Await delivery for maximum procedural leverage. End quote. Female asset. She read the words slowly enough that every person in that courtroom had time to feel them. Emmett did not flinch. Palmer closed his eyes. The petitioner knew about this pregnancy for 9 months. Galilea continued. He did not offer support. He did not contact the mother. He waited because the child was not a grandchild to him. The child was a procedural asset. She closed the folder. Then she asked the court one question. If the Gallagher family knew about this child for the full duration of the pregnancy, and their concern was the child's well-being, why did they wait until after the birth to file? The dynasty's attorney stood. Your Honor, we would request a brief recess to— Denied, Judge Alderman said. Answer the question. Silence. Not the kind that means someone is thinking. The kind that means the truth is so ugly that no arrangement of words can dress it for court. The attorney looked at Emmett. Emmett looked at the table. The courtroom smelled of old wood and floor polish and the faint staleness of recycled air. And in that silence, I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Galilea spoke into the gap. The silence in this courtroom, Your Honor, is the same silence the Gallagher family maintained for 9 months while they surveilled a pregnant woman and waited for the optimal moment to claim her child. We ask the court to recognize that silence for what it is. Judge Alderman ruled from the bench. Full custody to the mother. Surname Gleason to remain on all legal documents. Supervised visitation for the father, limited to twice monthly at a neutral facility. Emmett's attorney began to object, and the judge raised one hand. Mr. Gallagher, your family spent nearly 2 years surveilling this woman and called it concern. This court calls it something else entirely. The courtroom cleared in stages. Galilea squeezed my arm once. Emmett left without looking at me the first time he had ever been in a room with me, and not controlled it. Palmer passed my chair without stopping. He left a folded piece of paper on the edge of the table, warm from his pocket. I did not open it until I was alone in my car, hands gripping the cold steering wheel, tears falling for the first time since the hearing began. It read, there is a $35 million equity trust in my name. Half of it was built on your work. I will make sure it finds its way to Elio. I kept Palmer's note folded in my wallet for 3 days before I let myself believe it was real. The trust. The number. The promise written in the handwriting of a man I had stopped trusting long before I stopped loving him. Galilea verified everything before I allowed myself to feel anything about it. Emmett Gallagher walked out of Chittenden County Family Court without looking at his son, his attorney, or me. He buttoned his overcoat on the courthouse steps, climbed into a black car that was already running, and disappeared into the February gray, as if the last 2 hours had been a board meeting that simply did not go his way. Days later, Palmer texted just a time and the name of a park 3 blocks from my apartment. I left Elio with Fiora and went. He looked hollowed out, thinner, unshaven, wearing a coat that looked slept in, sitting on a bench in the February wind with no lawyer beside him. He had come alone, without a script. Just himself, which might have been the bravest thing Palmer Gallagher had done in years. "I am not here to ask for more than the court gave me," he said. The wind carried his words sideways. "I am here to tell you that I should have fought him years ago, not for the marriage, but for the right to be honest with you about why it was ending. I was a coward. I am sorry. Forgiveness is not a door. You open all at once. It is a series of locks, and Palmer had just turned the first one by showing up without armor. I do not need you to be sorry, Palmer," I said. "I need you to be a father on the 2 Saturdays a month. The court says you can be. That is enough. That is more than your father would have given him." His jaw tightened, not in anger, in recognition. "The trust transfer is already in motion," he said. His handshake when he stood was firmer than at the cafe, the grip of a man who had stopped pretending. "Galilea will have the paperwork by March. He will never need anything from the Gallagher name, only what I choose to give him as his father, not as an heir." He left the way he came, alone, walking into the wind, and I sat on that bench until my fingers went numb, because I needed the cold to keep me from feeling too much at once. March arrived the way Vermont springs do, grudgingly, with snow still clinging to the gutters the day Louise Gallagher appeared at my apartment door. She carried a cloth bag of baby clothes and a handwritten card tucked into the tissue paper. No phone call. No warning. Just a knock at 10 in the morning and a woman standing in my hallway, smelling of floral perfume. Something old-fashioned. The scent of a generation that kept its rebellions small. "I have been sending money since October," she said before I could ask. "Small amounts, 200, 300 at a time. Always cash. Emmett audits the accounts monthly, but he never checks my coat pockets. How do you measure the courage of a woman who spent 30 years silent and chose coat pockets as her weapon of resistance?" "That was you?" I said. I thought it was Fiora trying to be subtle. Something crossed her face that might have been a smile. "I made chamomile tea with honey, the first cup I had ever made for a Gallagher, in my own kitchen, and brought Elio out from his nap." Louise held him. "The way you hold something you have been waiting to touch for so long that your hands have forgotten how to be gentle carefully," trembling, as if he might dissolve if she breathed too hard. Elio cooed softly against her shoulder, and Louise pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling, the way people do when they are trying not to cry in someone else's home. "He has Palmer's chin," she whispered, "and your eyes, and neither of their tempers, God willing." She stayed for 40 minutes. She did not mention Emmett. She held my son and drank her tea, and when she stood to leave, she gripped my hand and said the only thing she had come to say. "I watched Emmett turn my son into a product. I did nothing because I told myself I was protecting Palmer by staying quiet. I was protecting myself." Her voice cracked. Thank you for not letting him grow up as a ledger entry. After she left, I sat on the couch with Elio asleep against my shoulder and opened the handwritten card. Inside was a photograph I had never seen Palmer at 5 years old, standing in front of Gallagher Technologies headquarters, holding his father's hand, wearing a tiny suit and a smile that had not yet learned to be afraid. On the back, Louise had written, "This is the boy I lost. Please raise yours differently." Beneath the photograph was a certified bank draft, the first installment from the Equity Trust, made out to Elio Gleason in the amount of $2.4 million. I deposited the trust draft into a custodial account the following week. $2.4 million. Made out to a 7-month-old boy who would not understand what it meant for years. And by then, I intended for it to mean opportunity, not inheritance. Louise's photograph of 5-year-old Palmer went into the drawer beside my bed, where I could look at it on the nights I needed reminding that the Gallagher name had once belonged to a boy who smiled without permission. Knox Sherwood had been standing in my kitchen for 11 months, making coffee he never drank, fixing a cabinet hinge I never asked about, reading to Elio in a voice so quiet it was almost a hum, and I had spent every one of those months pretending I did not know why. He arrived on a Tuesday evening in April, carrying takeout and a folded letter. He set the letter on the counter between us, while he unpacked containers, as if it were a receipt, and not the thing that would change the way I looked at him permanently. Company letterhead. Denver address. Senior director role. Corner office. Full relocation. The word declined was written across the bottom in his own handwriting, dated 3 weeks earlier. "I want you to see this so you understand," he said, his voice the same steady tone he had used the first day he walked into the office with a notepad of coffee orders. "I am not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I had somewhere. I said no 3 weeks ago. Why did you not tell me? Because I did not want you to feel like you owed me a reason to stay. You do not owe anyone that. Not anymore. There is a difference between a man who says he will stay and a man who shows you the door." He closed, and the difference is the 3 weeks of silence in between, where he carried the decision alone. Palmer had once told me he could not leave Burlington and then left. Knox was telling me he could leave Burlington and chose not to. The difference between those two sentences was everything I had spent 2 years learning. "I turned it down because I want to be here," Knox said. He smelled of cedar and clean cotton, familiar now. The scent of someone who had been present long enough to become ordinary. And ordinary had become the most extraordinary thing I could imagine. "Not because you need me. Because I watched you not need anyone for over a year, and it made me want to be the person you chose, not the person you settled for." I did not answer right away. I picked up Elio from his playmat and held him against my shoulder. His weight heavier, now solid, warm, the proof of everything I had fought for, curled against my neck with one fist gripping my collar. The kitchen clock ticked. April air drifted through the cracked window, carrying the smell of thawing earth and new rain. Trust is not a feeling. It is a muscle you tore once, and the rehabilitation is slow. And the therapist is just you, alone, deciding to lift the weight one more time. The last man who said he was staying left a pre-drafted agreement on the kitchen table, I said. So if I am slow, if I need time, it is not because of you. It is because of what I survived before you. Knox nodded. I am not asking for fast. I am not asking for a promise. I am asking for the chance to be here tomorrow. And the day after that. That is enough. We stood in the kitchen where I had once read emails that called me a female asset, and here was a man holding chamomile tea. He had made without being asked the same kind. I had served Louise weeks ago, now offered back to me by someone who had never once called me anything but my name. I reached for his hand, the way you reach for something you have been afraid to touch, slowly, deliberately, with the full understanding that this was not falling. This was choosing. And choosing, I had learned, was braver than falling ever was. His hand was warm, calloused at the palm. He held mine without squeezing, as if he understood that gentleness was the only language I could hear right now. Elio's breathing slowed against my shoulder. The clock ticked. The window let in rain-washed air. And for the first time in 2 years, the silence in my apartment was not absence. It was peace. Later that night, after Knox had gone home and Elio was in his crib, I sat at the kitchen counter and opened my laptop. There was a message from a Portland-based consulting firm, not a cold pitch, but a direct offer. Senior partner track, remote flexibility, relocation package. The sender's name was unfamiliar, but the referral line at the bottom was not. Referred by Galilea Goodwin, SQ, Burlington, VT. My attorney had been building me an exit strategy I never asked for. I stared at the screen and felt something. I had not felt since before the pregnancy test, before the Cold War, before the manila folder on the mahogany desk. I felt like the next chapter was mine to write. I accepted the Portland offer the next morning. Galilea had built the referral quietly over months, never mentioning it, never asking permission the way she did everything, with precision and without fanfare. I packed the Burlington apartment in 6 days, loaded Elio into the car seat, and drove south on I-89 toward a city where nobody knew the Gallagher name and nobody cared. That was 18 months ago. Elio was 2 years old and running barefoot through the October garden in Shelburne when I realized I had not thought about the Gallagher name in 11 days, and that the absence of it felt less like forgetting and more like healing. The cottage was mine, not the trust's, not Palmer's, not a gift from anyone who expected something in return. I had bought it with consulting fees I earned in Portland, 14 months of rebuilding a career on my own terms, in a city that knew me only as a sharp analyst with a toddler and an unhurried way of reading contracts. When the firm offered to let me work remotely from Vermont, I chose Shelburne because it was close enough to Burlington for Palmer's visits, and far enough that the Gallagher orbit could not reach my kitchen window. Knox stood at that kitchen window now, plating dinner, steam rising behind him. He had followed me to Portland without being asked, and back to Vermont without being told. He never asked to replace Palmer. He never asked to be called anything. Elio called him Knox, and Knox answered, and that was the whole arrangement. No title, no claim. Just a man who showed up every day because he wanted to. He found another acorn, Knox called through the open window. That is 14 today. I think he is building a reserve. He gets that from me, I said. The hoarding or the counting? Both. The people who tell you that strength is never needing anyone have never stood in a garden watching a man. They chose make dinner while a child. They fought for Chase's leaves because that is not needing. That is building. And building, I had learned, requires more courage than tearing down ever did. Palmer came last Saturday. He brought Ilio a wooden truck he had carved himself, not bought, carved, with a pocket knife and weekend patience. He had separated from Gallagher Technologies the previous spring, moved into a small apartment in Winooski, and started working as an independent systems consultant for companies that had never heard of his father. He stayed for 2 hours, played on the floor, and left without asking for more time. It was the most fatherly thing I had ever seen him do, and it had taken losing everything his father built to learn how. As the evening cooled, I went to the hall closet for a jacket. My hand found the old coat first, the one I had worn the day I walked out of Galilea's office with a news alert vibrating on my phone and a divorce still warm on my signature. The wool was familiar under my fingers. The collar had faded. I reached into the pocket instinctively, the same pocket where I had once hidden a folded ultrasound printout, the secret that started everything. The pocket was empty. The lining was worn smooth from months of carrying something that was no longer there. An empty pocket should feel like loss. Instead, it felt like putting down a suitcase I had been carrying through every room of every building for over 2 years, the sudden lightness of having nothing left to protect. The ultrasound had lived in that pocket for weeks, folded into quarters, carried like contraband. The first secret I ever kept to shield someone other than myself. I had built an entire life on the back of that secret. And now the pocket held nothing, and the life was full. I thought about the woman who had stood in the hallway outside Galilea's office 2.5 years ago, back against the wall. Phone buzzing, the world rearranging itself around a headline she did not see coming. She had been afraid. She had been alone. She had been exactly who she needed to be. I did not win because I was stronger than the Gallagher family. I won because I was patient enough to let the truth do what the truth does: arrive late, land heavy, and outlast every lie that got there first. I hung the coat back in the closet and walked to the garden door. Knox was plating rosemary and roasted vegetables, humming something tuneless the way he always did when he thought no one was listening. Elio was sitting in the grass with 14 acorns arranged in a careful line, counting them under his breath. The way I count everything precisely, completely, because the numbers never lie. I stepped outside into the October light. The air was sharp and bright on my lips, wood smoke and cold apple, and the particular sweetness of a Vermont autumn that lets go of everything and calls it beautiful. For the first time in 3 years, I did not look over my shoulder. There was no sedan. There was no silence waiting to be broken. There was only this: a kitchen, a garden, a boy with my name, and the unmistakable, hard-won sound of a life that belonged entirely to me. I spent 2.5 years carrying secrets I thought were protecting me, when the truth is, they were protecting the people who were hurting me. I let silence become my strategy, because I was afraid that speaking up would cost me everything. Do not make my mistake. Silence only protects the person who benefits from your quiet. The moment I stopped hiding the pregnancy, the surveillance, the documents, was the moment I started winning. Not because the evidence was powerful, but because the truth was. Some people will hear this and call it a revenge story. Maybe it is, but the revenge was never a plan I built. It was simply what happened when I refused to disappear quietly. Every woman who has been reduced to an asset on someone else's spreadsheet, every mother who has been told she is not enough While giving everything she has, your patience is not weakness. It is the foundation of the only revenge story that matters, the one where you outlast the people who underestimated you. I believe God put me through this for a reason, not to punish me, but to show me that the life I was fighting for was always meant to be mine. If this revenge story reminded you of someone you know, or if it stirred something you have been carrying quietly, share it with them. Sometimes the right story reaches the right person at exactly the right time. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done differently? I read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, come join me for the next story. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some details in this story were fictionalized for narrative purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental. The message that truth outlasts every lie